Hello, I'm Mark Carrigan, and in this session for the MA Digital Technologies, Communication and Education, we'll be talking about how education has been disrupted by the Covid-19 pandemic. Digital technologies were drawn upon at primary, secondary and tertiary level to ensure that distance education could still take place in spite of this unprecedented disruption. However, what this meant in practice varied widely throughout the world and reflected pre-existing inequalities, both within and between nations. There are three parts to this session. In the first, we'll go through an overview of the COVID-19 pandemic and why it was so disruptive. In the second, we'll look at distance learning around the world and how the form that it took reflected infrastructural inequalities that predated the pandemic. And thirdly, we'll analyse the politics of digital education in these terms, both to understand how it unfolded during the pandemic, but also to see what it might tell us about the future of education as we move into a post-pandemic world. What exactly do we mean when we talk about the COVID-19 crisis? So much has happened in less than 2 years that it can be helpful to look back at some of the key events, both to reflect on how quickly the crisis escalated, but also to understand how and why it had an impact on everyday life. We are, at the time I'm recording this, now entering a new stage of the crisis in the UK, with the announcement that remaining restrictions will be lifted in mid-July. However, with the current case rate of 20,000 a day predicted to double by the release of the restrictions, and the government's own figures estimating we might reach 100,000 cases a day by later in the summer, it seems premature, to say the least, to declare the crisis over, even though there has been a weakened causal chain between infection, hospitalisation, and death. To understand what this has meant for social life, we have to step back and think about the mechanisms underlying the disruption. At root, the threat of viral transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus, and COVID-19, the disease it gives rise to, meant that social life, normal social interaction, was problematised, i.e. it was rendered problematic. Everyday events which would have normally passed without notice suddenly came to seem full of risk because of the possibility of viral transmission. This was particularly the case early on when there was a lack of understanding of the virus and a degree of uncertainty about its transmission mechanisms. To see interactions as risky in this way inevitably changes how we relate to each other. We become aware of ourselves as potential transmission vectors with unpredictable consequences in the wider culture, because different people responded to this in different ways, and this reflects a whole host of pre-existing social trends. What are called non-pharmaceutical interventions have been crucial for suppressing transmission of the virus. This is a technical term for now familiar measures such as hand washing, mask wearing and social distancing. These are promoted by governments in order to try and drive down the rate at which an infected person is likely to pass the virus on to someone else. Perhaps the most significant of these was social distancing, but it might be more accurate to describe this as physical distancing. And this is why, to understand the implications of the pandemic, we have to understand the role of digital technologies. Technologies like social media and video calling platforms have meant that it's been much easier to sustain relationships at a distance than would have otherwise been the case. In spite of this, though, sites of intensive interaction, areas of the social world where a lot of people mix and do so closely, have obviously been particularly vulnerable to spreading infections. Leisure and retail are two obvious examples of this, but so too, crucially for our purposes, are educational institutions. There was nonetheless widespread agreement that sustaining primary, secondary and tertiary education were social priorities. There was a widespread sense that we might be able to live without bars and pubs and restaurants for a while, but education had to continue in some way. And this meant there was a significant role for digital technology in ensuring that education could be sustained at a distance. The disruption that education saw worldwide was unprecedented. UNESCO's data shows that at one point, 1.5 billion students worldwide, from pre-primary through to tertiary levels, had their schooling disrupted by the pandemic. However, what this meant in practice varied immensely because distance learning in an unexpected crisis inevitably relied upon the technology available within the educational system and across wider society at the point where the pandemic hit. The fact this wasn't planned for, in spite of the scientific consensus that a pandemic of this magnitude was an inevitability, is something we'll address in a later session. However, it's worth stressing that while this unexpected character made adaptation even more difficult than it would have otherwise been, it still would have been the case that even with prior planning and prior preparation, the capacity of education systems to respond to the crisis would have reflected inequalities within and between countries when it came to access to digital technology. The most obvious factor here is internet access, which varies hugely between regions. Compare the penetration rate in Africa and Asia to North America and Europe, for example. There are huge global disparities which shape the manner in which education could take place at a distance during the pandemic. And this explained the huge variation in what distance learning meant during the pandemic. UNESCO compiled an exhaustive list of national learning platforms which illustrated how these global inequalities in infrastructure manifested in different approaches to distance learning. For example, the majority of countries using radio for distance learning were in Africa, with none in Western Europe and North America. One way to analyse these differences is to think about broadcast media, such as radio and television, and how they're different to digital platforms, such as using open educational resources, websites, or YouTube. Broadcast media is, in a sense, less demanding for end users. Obviously, people still need a TV or radio, but there are more of these devices in circulation, and they tend to be cheaper than their digital equivalents. In contrast, though, they also tend to be less flexible, less interactive, and possibly less engaging. Other considerations are whether these are customized platforms that have been built for a specific purpose, or are more general commercial platforms being adapted for educational use. Have they been implemented in a centralized way by a national government? Or are regions, or even individual schools and universities left to make their own decisions about distance learning technologies? Are they using a single platform, or are they combining multiple platforms together? For all these reasons, what distance learning looks like globally is a more complex question than it might initially seem. It reflects the social and technological context in which these practices were taken up as a response to crisis. But these responses also contribute to changing that context by shaping who has been educated and in what way under these unprecedented, difficult conditions. These are fundamentally political questions about how a society distributes access to a valuable good, namely education. A widely made observation during the Covid-19 pandemic has been how it revealed existing inequalities, particularly when it came to who could work from home and who couldn't. I really like Martin Parker's imagery of the skeleton of the social structure being revealed by the pandemic. We need, I would suggest, to ask comparable questions about education and digital inequalities. What has the pandemic revealed about digital inequalities in education? Asking this requires that we look at significant differences within countries, rather than just between them. For example, let's look more closely at the UK. Only 86% of UK adults used the internet in 2020, with non-users tending to be older and less wealthy. There were 10% of users who relied on a mobile phone for access to the internet, mostly amongst less well-off 25 to 34-year-olds. How people access the internet can be as significant as whether or not they access it at all. What device are they using? How reliable is the connectivity? How many people are sharing it? How is access negotiated? These are all fundamentally qualitative questions which can be obscured by quantitative data about who is connected and who isn't. Furthermore, there are trade-offs involved in retaining connection. 4.7 million UK homes struggled to afford their telecoms bills in 2020, with over 1 million cutting back on spending on things like food and clothes in order to pay these bills. This suggests that, particularly during the pandemic, connectivity became a vital necessity, something which could not be dispensed with. And this involves what economists call opportunity costs, as other things are dispensed with in order to sustain that connectivity. How should we think theoretically about this? What should we even call it? Is it digital inequality, digital exclusion, digital poverty? These issues have risen up the political agenda during the pandemic, but there's still a pervasive lack of imagination, in which those for whom connectivity is something like running water often struggle to imagine how others have to relate to connectivity as a scarce resource. What do these questions mean for the kind of education students receive at primary, secondary and tertiary level? This is a huge question which we'll address in a more focused way in later sessions. But in this introduction, I want to suggest we can think of it usefully in terms of the different levels of digital divide. The first divide is the brute fact of internet access or its absence. The second divide is having the skills and knowledge to take full advantage of the internet. And the third divide is the way in which the first two divides can have real-world consequences. This might be a counterintuitive idea, but it's a very important one because it helps us recognise how there can be vicious circles in which digital exclusion reinforces existing social exclusion by preventing access to goods and services which others can access unproblematically. This idea invites us to look at how existing forms of social inequality might be reinforced or challenged by digital inequality. To look at digital education during the pandemic through this lens involves asking how students will be advantaged or disadvantaged by distance learning, in terms of each of these three levels. Who had access and who didn't? Who was already confident with online interaction and who wasn't? And how will these trends interact with existing forms of stratification? Will the already excluded be excluded further? These questions will help us dig into the politics of digital education during the pandemic. Who was disadvantaged by remote learning and who wasn't? I've highlighted digital inequality because it's such an important issue, but I want to stress that remote learning can be enabling as well, lest this seem like too negative an account. This is most obviously the case for students for whom face-to-face interaction raised accessibility issues, or those for whom school and universities were, for any number of reasons, difficult environments to inhabit. So we shouldn't see digitalization as merely constraining, but we should see it as enabling as well. And in this sense, it's something that social scientists talk about as a social structure, one that has become more central to understanding inequality and politics under our contemporary conditions. An obvious question to ask, though, when we talk about the pandemic and where it's leading us is, when will the pandemic end? The histories of past pandemics suggest they end when it fades into the background for the majority of people within a particular community. Less so that the disease has been eradicated, but more that the sense of crisis has passed, and the remaining risks fade into the background alongside other risks we negotiate in everyday life. It remains to be seen whether the success of the vaccination programme means the UK is nearing this point, though we should note that no end is in sight globally for the pandemic. The sociologist Nicholas Christakis usefully distinguishes between what he terms the intermediate pandemic and the post-pandemic. In the former, we are recovering from the overall clinical, psychological, social and economic shocks of the pandemic and the adjustments they've required. In the latter, things will return to normal, but this is a new normal, a normal in a world that has featured persistent changes as a consequence of these adaptations. The question I think this leads us to ask about education is, what are the shocks which education systems are still adjusting to? Things like the loss of face-to-face interaction over a prolonged period of time, the disruption of normal organisational routines, the adaptation involved in new modes of delivery, and the inequalities of access opened up by these new ways of engaging in educational processes. In this session, I've mapped out some of the key issues relating to the politics of digital education during the pandemic, why it was so disruptive to education, the global landscape of digital education during the pandemic, and the significance of digital inequalities in pandemic education. In the following sessions, we'll be looking in a lot more detail at these issues with regard to primary, secondary and tertiary systems, in order to ground this analysis in more detailed engagement with the specific character of education at each of these levels. The question which runs through these sessions is the post-pandemic. Where is this leading? How will education systems be transformed by this crisis? How is this entangled with wider social, political, cultural and economic changes? In other words, if we're not returning to normal life as we know it in early 2020, then where are we going? And what will education look like when we get there?